Greetings, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amir Pasek. I'm the Dean of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and you are joining an instance of the series of our Higher Education and Philanthropy Initiative, which was launched to generate useful knowledge about how philanthropy engages higher education. The initiative connects researchers, funders, and practitioners to work together on learning how philanthropy can better contribute to higher education and its public purpose. Today, we are thrilled to have our special guest, Holden Thorp. Holden Thorp became editor-in-chief of Science, the Science family of journals, in 2019. He came to Science from Washington University, where he was provost and professor. He is currently also a professor at George Washington University and on leave to serve as editor-in-chief of Science. Thorp joined Washington University after spending 3 decades at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he served as the 10th chancellor of the university. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree from UNC, a doctorate in chemistry from Caltech, and he completed postdoctoral work at Yale University. He holds honorary degrees from Hofstra and North Carolina Wesleyan, and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Inventors, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He also co-founded Viamet Pharmaceuticals and is a venture partner with Hatteras Venture Partners. He's also on the boards of PBS, the College Advising Corps, and St. Louis University. He serves on the scientific advisory boards of the Yale School of Medicine and the Underwriters Laboratories Research Institute. In 2023, STAT named Thorp to its status list of top leaders in the life sciences. For our purpose today, perhaps most interestingly, he is the co-author with Buck Goldstein of 2 books on higher education. One is titled Engines of Innovation, the Entrepreneurial University in the 21st Century, and the more recent one is Our Higher Calling, Rebuilding the Partnership Between America and Its Colleges and Universities, both from UNC Press. Our host for today's webinar is our very own senior fellow, Susan King. Before joining us, she served as John Thomas Kerr Distinguished Professor and Dean of the Hussman School of Journalism and Media for the UNC Chapel Hill. She launched and led the Knight Initiative on the future of journalism education at the Carnegie Corporation before becoming dean, where she served as vice president for external affairs. Prior to that, she had distinguished careers in public affairs and journalism. Welcome to you both. I will monitor the questions and we'll have some of my own prepared. But in the meantime, the Zoom room is yours, Susan.
Thanks so much, Dean Pasek. And I look forward to Holden, Dr. Thorp. Holden, I hope I can call you.
Please.
Since we did work together at UNC. You know, you have such a unique perspective to really launch this conversation, which we feel is pretty critical because you've been at every phase, clearly every phase of the academic pursuit. And as a board member and a trustee and someone who looks at the big picture, as you've done with 2 books, you've got vision. I really want to start from there. You have distinct ideas about what the university needs to do and should be as an institution, but we're in a moment, if my field is setting the tone, it uses words like tumultuous universities. You know, they have a problem. We're at a crossroads. How do you see this moment?
Yeah, I agree that we are at a tumultuous moment. And, you know, I've had a lot of good timing and bad timing throughout my career. I became the chancellor of UNC at the beginning of the financial crisis of 2008, and also when there was a longstanding problem in the athletics department that had never surfaced, and it surfaced while I was there. That wasn't the best timing in the world. But when I decided to get out of higher education administration and come run science, I had good timing because I didn't have to deal with the pandemic and with the war in Gaza. And these, in my opinion, are the 2 most difficult things that have hit higher education in my lifetime. I was alive in 1968, but I was 4 years old, so I don't really remember what was going on there. I think that was a tumultuous time also. But in the time that I've been observing higher education, both of these things are the biggest things that have happened. And I think that it is easy to criticize administrators for how they've handled it. Lots of people have opinions about it, but they're both completely unprecedented. You know, people, my fans, will say, oh, if you were running things, this would have gone better. There is zero way to speculate on that, because I never faced any protests that were on the scale of the ones that are being faced now. Most universities, regardless of whether the president was a Republican or a Democrat or an academic or a non-traditional person, all had more or less the same trajectory within, some range. And on the pandemic, same thing. There were people who said, we're not going to close our schools, and then they had to. And there were people who closed and, in my opinion, probably did the right thing, but then they got yelled at for not trying to open. And so these two things, and then of course, you have the psychological toll of both of these, especially the pandemic, which probably took the greatest psychological toll on young people in my lifetime, for sure. And so when you put all that together and then you layer it on top of all the other problems, then I think that leads us to the moment where we are right now. And I would say the biggest challenge that higher education had, which is now even more apparent, is that it's really been viewed as something that benefits people who are ambitious and want to leave where they are, right? Because most people who get a college education do careers that you need to do in fairly populated areas. Whereas people who want to stay in their hometowns in more rural parts of America, we've never really said, hey, this is what's here for you. Now we know what it is. It's all the knowledge that we generate and the economic activity that we produce. But we've done such a bad job of explaining that to people that they see the American dream of higher education as, I'm going to go to Indiana and I'm going to get a degree doing something in the knowledge economy, and then I'm going to move to Indianapolis or out of state. And we haven't told the people in rural Indiana or any other state that has rural areas, this is what we're doing for everyone in your state. And until we crack that problem, which is really what our second book was about, then when you have these body blows like the pandemic or October 7th, then the institutions are going to be even more susceptible to sort of getting down in trust. Yeah.
Well, and I've got the book here, Our Higher Calling. I mean, so right in your title, it's clear what you see the university as, but there is such a lack of trust. I mean, all our institutions have lost trust over the last decade, but the university particular. So in the rebuilding, in this book, you talk about rebuilding a partnership. And I take it a partnership with the public, the parents, the students. Talk a little bit about that and maybe even the role of philanthropy in helping to rebuild this partnership.
Yeah, so you're the journalist, the professional journalist. I'm an accidental journalist who came to it late in life and is learning on the fly, but I get to work with 40 world-class science journalists who keep me straight. But I think we would both agree that you don't build trust by not engaging with your stakeholders. And unfortunately, these universities have become so bureaucratic that the public relations professionals and the attorneys and the other kinds of bureaucrats that have surrounded the leadership have made them very reluctant to engage, except when they have good news to share. And these institutions, as you and I both well know, having lived together through such an event, don't always have good news to share. And, I learned this the hard way, and I try to keep my colleagues from relearning the same thing that I learned. You've got to engage with people when you have good news and when you have bad. And if you're out bragging about things you know, your latest AI initiative or your latest big gift that you got. But then when a problem happens, you just have your PR team write a terse statement and you won't take questions on the record, and, you know, you're not showing up at stuff and talking to people, then that exacerbates the loss of trust. And so I think that I mean, there are a lot of reasons why institutions generally are losing trust. And most of it has to do with the fact that, you know, in a populist movement like you have in the United States, but not just here, you know, we had one in Brazil, there's clearly one in Europe. When you have these populist movements, institutions usually take some hits because they're seen as places for the elites and so on. So those attacks are the main reason, but you know, you have to play defense too, and you can't play defense if you're hiding under your desk. And unfortunately, I think when these institutions get themselves into challenges, the response is overly bureaucratic, overly scripted, and people want to see someone who's being genuine. And I just really worry about our institutions, that they've gotten themselves so wrapped up in their rules and everything that they can't seem to explain to people why things are going the way they are.
Yeah, in journalism, we'd say the word, you need to be transparent. Now, easier said than done. So another headline we're seeing all over in op-eds, I think you've written one on this too. Who wants to be a president of a university today? You know, I think it used to be something that's really sought after. But you're talking about you need to be a chief communicator. You need to really represent the soul of the university. And these days you have to be a fundraiser. So what kind of advice can you share, you know, sort of studying it, to those who are thinking about being the next generation of university leaders?
Yeah, well, hopefully people still will do it, even though it looks very unattractive at the moment. And I think they are. I mean, a lot of presidencies are open, that's for sure. But people do seem to be hiring folks to do these jobs. And these are important, amazing institutions. And so somebody's always going to want to lead them. But I think the game has changed pretty significantly. You know, when I became the chancellor of UNC Chapel Hill, it was a blue state. In the 2008 election, right after I got appointed, Barack Obama carried North Carolina. Bev Perdue was the first woman governor of North Carolina, and the legislature was both houses were Democratic, and they were led by people that I'd known my whole life. And so, and I was trying to emulate people who were also part of the progressive tradition in North Carolina, like Bill Aycock and Frank Porter Graham. And that all changed in 2010. It changed. The Republicans ran the table. And maybe it was the case that for a southern state like North Carolina, that should have happened sooner. But it did happen when it did. And it revealed the fact that these are very, very political jobs at public universities. And sometimes it shocks people when you say that, but the trustees are appointed by elected officials, usually because they are good at raising money for the officials who got elected, and then they choose the president. So what part of that isn't political? It's just that when your side is in control, you kind of don't notice it. And so that big change that happened in North Carolina really revealed how much a role politics plays in these universities. And, you know, some people are on my successor, Lee Roberts' case, because he was close to Republican politics. And I have to tell him, well, I became chancellor of UNC partly because I was close to Democratic politics. That's how these places work. And so if that's the first thing, if you're going to run a public university, you better love politics. You're going to be going to the legislature. You're going to be working both sides of the aisle. You're going to be, thinking that you're going to be Mr. Chips and not a political actor is very naive. I was extremely naive about that, but I didn't have any context really against which to judge that because things had been the same in North Carolina for so long. Then you're going to be a fundraiser for sure. And in some ways, I always found that the easiest.
Oh,
Yeah, because most people go into fundraising, their problem is that they have trouble asking for the gift. I'm a very, very literal person. So if it says on the briefing, say these things to this person and then ask them for such and such, then I'm going to follow that to the letter. I don't feel antsy or anything about that. I'm looking at something in black and white that says ask for the gift, and that's what I'm going to do. So as long as I had good instructions from my development team, I did actually, that's a big part of how I became the chancellor of UNC Chapel Hill. And then I think the second thing, and this is a very style-based question, is are you going to be somebody who is surrounded by a lot of people who are helping you, whose office is hard to get into, or are you going to be somebody who's walking around chatting up the groundskeepers and the housekeepers and the students and the faculty, and are you going to teach and all that kind of stuff? Now, I was the latter, and some people would have said that correctly that I should have been spending more time in the State House than I was wandering around the campus, figuring out what everybody was up to. But of course, if I was the other way around, people would have said, well, we never see Holden. And so there's not necessarily a right answer about these two things. The campus clearly prefers a leader who's around. But the politics can be pretty tough on the other side if you go that route. I happen to think at the moment that the leader being engaged on the campus is incredibly important, or at least to have somebody who's in the inner circle who's doing that, because these places, they're feeling very separated from the president sometimes. And that once that happens, it's very hard to put those things back together. But you could make another case that it's a political job and the president should be spending most of their time in the State House. Now, of course, in private universities, you have a different thing. I worked in that environment at WashU. Our chancellor spent a lot of time raising money and a lot of time overseas. And he let me be the mayor of the campus, which I loved, and it worked well for him. So we had a very good handoff there. So a lot of these things are stylistic, and I think it's very important for people to decide which one of these things they're going to be. You can always change it, but a lot of times you see people who are leaving and they realize, if they put more emphasis over here or over there, things may have come out differently. And so these are really important choices.
And I think what you're also saying is you've got to be very deliberate in how you think about your leadership at the particular university you're going to lead. Let me marry philanthropy and politics for a moment, because you described that really well in how the state changed and how, let's be realistic. In a state university, it does reflect who the leadership of the legislature is, et cetera. But philanthropy has also become pretty political, particularly entrepreneurs who have made a lot of money have distinct ideas about what a university should be and what they want to support. So bringing those two areas together, as a president, you may see what, and I want you to give your vision right now as someone who's been it too, but you may see what's the most needed thing at this moment. Maybe it is more research dollars for really thorny questions. Maybe it's more student money and access because the cost of universities are so large. How do you work that politics when others have a totally different view of what they think the university should be?
Yeah, well, it's only impossible because because the campus mostly wants money for endowed chairs and student support and buildings. Those are the things that universities have always wanted to raise money for. They help the budget, they help you get talented people, and they help you build the facilities to do your work. But as you're pointing out, there are a lot of entrepreneurs, and there have always been people from other sectors who thought similarly, who have their own vision for how their philanthropy is to be used. And in those cases, the president has to make some very challenging decisions. And I've made some of those. I've gone in both directions on those. I've said to somebody, my development person is going to kill me, but I can't take that. And I've done that many times at UNC, just because people wanted to give for something that they either would have had too much involvement in, or it was the kind of program that we didn't really want to do, or it wasn't going to help everybody in the way that you hope philanthropy will. And there are other times when there are very specific ideas where I took the money and built new and creative things, and because I felt like I had enough of a partnership with the donor that we could go back and forth and be together on the things that we wanted to do. And when I was in St. Louis, I had somebody else making those decisions, and then I had to figure out how to make them work. There were some times when I got sent to implement a philanthropic program that wouldn't have been what I would choose, but it was my job to make it work. And there were other times when we got things that I was just so grateful for, because they went to the core. Most provosts and deans want things that go to their core mission, right? To teaching and scholarship. But there are other great things that universities do that add to the reputation and visibility of the university and enthuse donors. And these are all challenging many, many times a day, which is why they start to look tired after a few years. It's not the pace of going to all the events. It's not the frustrations with the faculty governance or whatever. Usually it's just the monumental decision after another that you have to make that has far-reaching consequences. And we know from social science that this wears people down. And that's really the stamina that you have to survive for a long time in these jobs.
And that's why they're also never boring, I have to.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely.
There are two pillars of this initiative, the Higher Education Initiative that Lilly is running. One is innovation, and I want to talk to you about that because your entrepreneurial book, that soul of the university. But the other is governance. And so following what you just talked about in terms of working with philanthropists, et cetera, some who had ideas that matched yours, some that different, but creating a partnership. Do you think there's so many details that go into these in terms of the development office, timing of the gift, who will give when, et cetera? Does it fit the university lawyers' needs? But there's often not a real explicit discussion about, we want you to name our school or our center or whatever, but you don't get to run it, et cetera. Explicit. There's a scholarship, but you don't get to pick the students who will get it. Do you think there needs to be more details around governance and philanthropy?
There's probably nobody who takes a gift who doesn't wish they'd done more to explain this. There are a few donors that are just happy to see their money used and see the leaders feeling like they're getting something out of it. But most of the time, it's more demanding than that. And I think for me, it always came down to whether I felt I could go back and forth honestly with the donor. I mean, as I said, I'm a very literal and direct person. So I'm more likely to say, that's a cool idea, but we probably can't do that. And so some people who make it longer in college presidencies than I did are probably a little smoother when it comes to that kind of thing. But the payoff of that is that I think some of the donors that I worked with the closest felt like they could trust me because they knew that if I thought they were pushing it too far, I would tell them. And so those were very personal interactions. And I would say my archetype of the best donor, was the hard chargers from New York City, who like somebody to talk like a New Yorker to them, because I may have a Southern accent, but I'm just as direct as they are. Other people are better with the sort of people who want something a lot smoother. So my style, which is, there's no right answer to this, but my style was to be extremely direct with people about what we could and couldn't do. And if there are some things you can do where you're very direct and you can come through with them, then that builds enough trust that you can get through the periods of disagreement. But, the main thing we're talking about here is how labor intensive it is. Most of these gift things that go off the rails are when the relationship hasn't been tended to and the donor is surprised by something that happens that they didn't think their money would be used for. And that is one of the things you have to sign up for when you take a big gift, is that the donor is mostly not entitled to tell you what to do with it, but they're entitled to know how their money's being spent in real time. And I think a lot of these things that go sideways, that's what happened. You sign the gift, there's a party, things get started, and then the next thing you know, the donor is somehow upset about something that's gone down. And maybe some of those can't be avoided, but working to make sure you minimize the chance that that's going to happen is a lot of work. And sometimes, unfortunately, the donor thinks the only person that should be doing that is the president of the university. And in your case, she's got a lot of other things to work on.
Well,
Yeah.
I have to say that sometimes faculty would ask me, do we get morals clauses in some of these gifts, especially with names on it? Because something can look fine one year and not a decade later. What do you think about that as they're studying this kind of issue of governance?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those things are really important, and they're very fuzzy. They're very hard for a literal guy like me. Yeah. Every one of these things is a judgment call as to whether you think things will work out positively. And so the only remedy for that is having confidence that if there's a problem, you'll be able to come up with a way to work it out.
Of course, after you left, we probably had to work out a few of them because our relationship was up. Going on to the other pillar of this initiative, which was innovation. And I've got your other book, The Engines of Innovation. You really were talking about bringing a soul of entrepreneurship to the university, and that would have a cascading impact upon the way things were done. Innovation means a lot of different things, but in philanthropy, we're wondering if innovation should be ways to change how the university is actually working. So UNC and WashU, well endowed, other institutions not. Should there be more, cross-campus initiatives where philanthropy gets involved rather than just, an individual institution that's doing an elite, probably, institution too? Give us your insights.
So cross-campus, you mean among different universities, or
it could be across HBCUs linking in with UNC.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I think there's a lot of challenges with the words innovation and entrepreneurship among many academics. And we basically got that through at UNC because I was working on this before I was in the administration, and I spent a lot of time helping professors see how they were actually entrepreneurs and didn't realize it. They may not like calling it that, but if you get grants and run a lab, you got to get more grants to keep your lab going. You're an entrepreneur who's the CEO of a little company, right?
Yeah.
Of graduate students and postdocs and who's ever in your lab. If you're a humanities professor, you got to get your book contract and you got to execute your book contract and deliver on it. And so these are all small to sometimes very large entrepreneurs in the business world. I mean, if you were looking at this as a business, you would say, this is a collection of 3,000 entrepreneurs, not one big thing. Now the faculty, some of them don't like to have it pointed out in stark terms that that's what they're doing, but it is. And the personal curiosity and initiative that they're using to drive their scholarly activity is very entrepreneurial, and it always has been for the whole history of higher education. So that's kind of, and you know, what we did at UNC was we did it pretty slowly as we built it up, so that, you know, we did things like we had an English professor who taught about Shakespeare plays that had entrepreneurs in it, and we had philosophy professors who tried to understand the difference between lying and selling, and you know, lots of things where people could plug in. And over time, everybody saw that this was, not everybody, enough people saw that this wasn't threatening, that we were able to do it. So that's kind of how the innovation and entrepreneurship thing works. If it's just a thing for the biology professors who have a new drug, then, I mean, you can do that, but it's not going to transform the culture of the campus. Now, in
And a
terms,
mindset, and a
yeah,
mindset. And I want to pursue that because I do see frustration on the part of many editorial writers, those outside the university, that so much of the research seems irrelevant, you know, and we may talk the high knowledge producing, but they don't see it always as having an impact. And you always talk about public facing research that's really at the core of what some of the big questions are. Talk about that a little bit and how philanthropy could advance it.
yeah, you can't do anything about the fact that most people in the public care about the research that's going to impact them. A drug that saved their lives or one of their family members, technology that they're using to do all the things that we're doing right this second. You know, economics research that is used to set policy. You know, this one's delicate, but it could be done with enough effort. Climate research that says this is how things are affected in Indiana or in Wisconsin or in Illinois, rather than, you know, this is what's going on with the whole planet. We've done a bad job of that. So so you've got to hook people in if you're going to explain research to them with how it's affecting them. Now, unfortunately, that may mean you're only going to talk about a few faculty members at your university when you have 3,000. And so what about the other 2,995? Well, you've got to convince them that using what you can use to build public support is the best way to get the public support. And trying to explain to them why string theory is important in finding a new drug, which I could do if you gave me enough time, because you can't have drugs without physics, and you can't have physics without particles, and you can't have particles without string theory. But most people fall asleep before I even finish that sentence. So the string theorists are just going to have to live with the fact that we understand that, but we may not be going around telling everybody why string theory is critical for the war on disease. And this is how science has always been explained to the public in the United States since 1945, when we first created the federally funded scientific enterprise in the United States. And Vannevar Bush wrote his paper that was used as the basis for starting the National Science Foundation. And the three hooks were the war on disease, a strong economy, and a strong military. Those were the three reasons why we needed to fund science. And then there's a bunch of stuff in there about how basic science is how you get there. But he didn't try to tell the Congress people, probably all congressmen at that time, about basic science first. He said, we're gonna do these three very applied things, and then I'm hoping you'll trust me to explain to you why we need to do it the way we need to do it. Now, I think that vision needs to be seriously updated. And I cringe around Washington when I hear people say those same three talking points 80 years later. But they are the three that worked, and they're still used. So it's really important to build a sense of trust so that you can use the things that will hook people in and still have everybody believe that you're for them also.
So let's do it from the perspective now of student preparing to go to university and the parents who probably are going through with the students and are the ones who are going to be thinking about funding it. And from that political point that you just said, Abraham Lincoln saw the power of the university and did the land grant in legislation that, transformed our higher education system. Right now, two data points. One, the Federal Reserve just came out with a study that sort of indicates that the personal investment by the public may not be as great in higher education, getting a degree, undergraduate degree, as it used to be. And even President Obama at the Democratic convention this summer was sort of praising Kamala Harris as saying the only way into the middle class is not necessarily a college degree. You talk about in your books is the college degree is the front door to the middle class. So how at this moment do you talk to those young people who are looking at enormous costs to go to college or enormous debt, that this is really worth the time and the finances to have a university degree?
Yeah, well, some of them are going to want to do things where you have to have one. So if they want to be a physician or a nurse practitioner or a lawyer or all these things, then that's built in. But then you have lots of folks who, and this is the ideal way to go to college, I always say to people, don't make up your mind what you're going to do before you go to college, because you haven't seen all the things that college is going to show you. Yeah. And so we still need that desperately for people to come to universities and find out what they're passionate about and go figure out how to go do that, or how to use the habits of mind that they develop. So of course we need to continue to make it more accessible so that the cost isn't a barrier in the way that you're saying. And we have lots of schools that have progressive financial aid policies, or public universities that are already deeply discounted in their in-state tuition. And we need to continue to raise money for student support so that we can continue to sustain that, so that it isn't as much of an economic question for people that it is. But this also gets back to my point earlier, which is, and I would say we were guilty of this in our books. We made the somewhat lazy assumption that everybody wanted to go to college and move to a major urban area and be a professional in some professional line of work. Not everybody wants to do that. Some people want to stay where they are and take care of their family and have a job where they can own their own home. And I do think that has been a realization that has come along the last few years. And it's probably a product of the questions that people are asking about higher education, and they're entitled to answer those. And their tax dollars are supporting these universities either through federal taxes that go to federal financial aid and federal research, or through state taxes that go to support the state universities. And the universities have to face up to this problem. And I don't think that they have. You know, another solution that a lot of people work very hard at is to have a really great career program to help folks when they get out. And different places do that better than others. But I don't know a single university president who doesn't want to make their career program better. And the reason is because they want to have a good answer to this question. And also because they want their students to, I mean, these are schools. The students should achieve what it is that they want to achieve when they leave. And that's another thing that I think does seep out a little bit, is when the students perceive the faculty as having positive or negative views of what they want to do when they get out. And we really need to get rid of that, because that really reinforces this idea that these places are not there to help you achieve your dreams. So every faculty member that has any kind of indication that one of their students is doing a more or less worthy career path when they get out, we really need to shame those people into not doing that anymore, because that is really, really hurting us. In the graduate school in the sciences, it's awful. We have lots of students whose mentors expect them to continue in a very narrow definition of what science is, and when they don't want to do that, the mentor sometimes loses interest in the students. And I've had a lot of people visit me and write to me with this problem, and it is an awful, awful look for higher education that we would do that. I just write back and say, tell your boss to call me. I'm going to explain to him that this is a school.
I love the fact you brought so many insights from all the different jobs you have, but most of all, I appreciate that frankness. Holden, that is your mark and your brand. And I know Dean Pasek has some questions, so
Sure.
I'm going to send it over to you.
Well, thank you both. That was a wonderful conversation so far. I just want to encourage our audience members to put their questions in the Q&A box. And I see we already have one, but let me start off with a couple of questions first, if I may. In your later book, Holden, you talk about the university as a kind of special community that meaningfully engages all of our identities as members, which allows us to do certain things that other organizations can't. Since you've written the book, do you still think that we are engaging identities in a more expansive way, or are faculty, students, and staff becoming more transactional in their approach to how they see themselves in a university?
Well, I was certainly, we were certainly putting that out there as an ideal that could be strived for. And I do think there are a lot of people in the universities who still want to do that. But I agree with you that there are a lot of folks who are coming to universities with very specific expectations for what they're going to get on the other end, whether it's a certain job or a certain career advancement for faculty and staff. And those are logical things to want, because you're investing time and money into engaging in these places. And so getting that higher calling as high as it should be was hard before, but it's a lot harder now.
Yeah, yeah. It does seem that to me, from our little vantage point, people are just a little bit more uncertain and want to be able to count, if I'm spending an hour doing this, how am I going to get a consideration for it? Whereas earlier it might have been more openly engaged. One of the things you've also talked about in your book is this institutional isomorphism that we tend to in higher education. And you have this lovely quote that some faculty say that nothing should be done for the first time, right? That goes counter to the notion of entrepreneurship and belies the fact that many of them actually do innovation in the other part of their world where they're always trying to, push the frontiers of their field. Do you think that this is something that philanthropy is helping to create more of a sameness, or do you think philanthropy is actually helping to create more innovation and difference in your experience?
Well, let's analyze the problem first, and then so I can stall long enough to think of the answer to your question. Yeah, so look, we have a huge problem with higher education, and that is that everybody is comparing themselves to some institution that's further up in whatever status you want to be further up in and trying to be just like them. And these places are all capable of having their own identity and their own things that they stand for, and being more excited about their own excellence than they usually are. So whenever I get called to go to a university and asked about their strategy or whatever, usually the first thing I tell anybody is quit thinking about whatever university you happen to be comparing yourself to and start figuring out how to be who you are. These places could be different. They're in much different locations, many of them. They have much different student body that they interact with. And many of them do have an identity that they just can't say out loud because it might exclude people. So for example, when I was at WashU, everybody secretly knew that it was a life sciences university. 90% of the funding was in the medical school. Most of our student undergrads were pre-med, and most people who know what WashU is are in medicine or biological sciences. But of course, the chancellor never got up and said, "Welcome to Washington University, a life sciences university." I don't think the English department of the business school would be very happy with them. And that's too bad, because these places do have their own identity. And when the politics are such that you can't actually claim it, you're losing a lot of differentiation that you could get. So that's, in my opinion, the problem. And I guess the way philanthropy could solve that is that it could, you could use philanthropy to enhance the parts of the university. I mean, most philanthropists want to bet on the part of the university that's excellent. And on the one hand, that may further alienate some of the other stakeholders, but it gives the administration a way to continue to bet on what they're excellent in, which is really strategically what these places should do. I say that having been mostly unsuccessful at doing that. WashU had a great undergraduate program and a great medical school. And I used to say, why don't we just focus on those two things? But of course, you got trustees who are allied with this school or that school, and faculty speaking out about this school or that school. And these things are just, we're just constantly promising everybody that we're everything. And that makes it very hard for these places to differentiate themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And so let me ask one more question before I turn to our very informed questions in this. And both, when you were talking to Susan, the idea came up of the fact that we haven't done a very good job of explaining the value of college to somebody who doesn't want to leave their locality and become a metropolitan professional, right? And we've seen the cleavage between people with bachelor's degrees and those without growing in our society, which we hadn't really expected, or nobody really wanted that to happen. you know, against the background of philanthropy having been kind of the spur of a lot of innovations in higher education over the years, everything from the credit hour to Pell Grants to pensions, you know, a lot of things that became policy were often incubated first in philanthropic circles more quietly. Are there some things that we should think about more expansively in terms of reforming the institutional forms that we're using to deliver education right now? You know, you're probably familiar with all the ed tech froth about how we can, you know, completely transform the way everything is done. But is there something between that complete kind of transformation of everything and putting it online to the institutions that we have that would be interesting to solve some of this problem that you identified in terms of, you know, we talk about college for all, but we don't seem to figure out how to deliver it with the current institutional form that we have.
Yeah, and that's because we only know how to generate revenue by bringing people to campus and charging them tuition. You know, most of the remote things either didn't work well or weren't financially viable. But here's one thing I'll point out. We think of Coursera, which was the, you know, the MOOCs, the online classes. A lot of people think that didn't succeed. It really succeeded in K through 12. It didn't replace universities like everybody thought. And you remember Terry Sullivan got fired temporarily as the president of the University of Virginia because her trustees thought she was going to get put out of business by online classes. That didn't happen. But the effect that Coursera has had on K through 12 has been significant, especially, you know, in lots of different areas of the country. So I think everybody has to have an open mind when they're looking at these things and thinking about whether they succeeded or not. But, you know, this problem is not solved. Every university has tried to do it. I do think there are some places, and I'm sure Indiana is one that's working at this with their what we used to call the evening colleges, their colleges of professional studies or whatever it is. These are really important functions of the university. Unfortunately, sometimes they get used as a revenue source rather than as a public outreach arm. You know, we had one of those at WashU, and I worked hard to try to revise it. I didn't get to finish doing that, but I know they're still trying. And St. Louis is a really good place where something like that needs to happen. But it's tough because you got to figure out how to staff it and where you're going to have the classes, and you got to have just as many administrators taking care of the students as you do for the residential undergrads, and that's a tough nut. But I wish the more universities would put more effort into doing that.
We are trying to figure out how to integrate it with the enterprise rather than have it kind of a side kind of an auxiliary service that's not really part of the enterprise.
Yeah, that's a good goal.
Hoping to do that. Well, thank you. So one of our questions has to do with trustees, and because I know everybody who's in the room, I feel okay by you know, picking on an anonymous questioner, so it's not somebody out of left field. Somebody who asks about trustees. Most trustees are little seen or heard until there's a public crisis requiring the board to defend or remove the CEO. Trustees legally have ultimate responsibility for mission and program. Shouldn't they be more accountable instead of letting the CEO be the target for public grievance? Obviously, there are differences between the publics and the privates. How would you reform the process of appointing and holding trustees and keeping them accountable?
Well, I don't know if you can reform it because the statutes are such that they're going to be chosen politically at public universities, and it's hard for them not to be chosen based on philanthropy at private universities. Some private universities, and I'm fortunate that St. Louis University is one that asked me to serve this role for them, do have a number of higher education professionals on their board. And some of the very top places do that, and some of the others are emulating that. The Jesuit schools typically have other Jesuit priests who've been presidents of colleges. That's what we have at SLU. I'm the first lay former president on the board. And that helps a lot to have people who can actually explain when the doors are closed what's actually going on. But my main remedy for this is that trustees need to behave the same way they would behave if they were trustees of a corporation, and reading rules about good governance. And that is, they should be invisible most of the time. They should talk to the CEO with anything critical only in private. And when there is a crisis, they should support the CEO. But as you point out, what happens mostly is they come to town, they hear a bunch of good news about how good the university is. They have students in a cappella groups come sing at their dinner. They get all weepy-eyed about when they were alumni at whatever school it was, and then they go home thinking everything's fine. And that's what they wanted, because it's prestigious to be on the board, and if it's a big time sports school, they also get to be around the teams more. And then when there's a crisis, suddenly they realize, oh, they actually have to do work. And that's partly the CEO's fault, because they haven't been making them work up until that point. But they have to realize that, you know, they're going to do a bunch of work and not get any visibility out of it. I mean, the only trustee that should ever speak to the media is the chair. And in corporate governance, you would always have that role. And unfortunately, we have a lot of public university trustees, especially, who like to call up the media off the record or even on the record. I'm not sure which is worse. They're both bad. And make life more complicated for the president, who's already getting overwhelmed by so many different things that are happening. And this is basically the dynamic that led me to leave the University of North Carolina when I did. I could not get ahead of the crisis, because in addition to trying to bring my lumbering bureaucracy along, I had trustees. I'd wake up and see some trustee saying something to the media that I couldn't rein back in. And I can tell you that if this happened on the PBS board or the board of St. Louis University, where I have the privilege of serving, if I did that, I would be asked to resign from the board, and properly so, in my view. So I guess my remedy for this whole thing is for the trustees to realize their job is to support. I mean, when I went to WashU, I had one earth-shattering moment. The chancellor and I were talking to the students about something that they wanted. I can't remember what it was, but we decided to give them something they thought, probably correctly, that would be too progressive for our trustees. And they asked the chancellor, they said, well, won't the board have a view about this? And he said, yeah, they can tell me about it next year at my performance evaluation. I mean, the board should evaluate the chancellor one day a year, and they should support the chancellor the other 364 days of the year. And unfortunately, a lot of trustees get caught up in these things and worry about how it looks for them, rather than doing what they're there to do, which is what any board's supposed to do, which is to support management.
Well, thank you for that summary of experience and good principles of governance. We are out of time, but I want to give you the opportunity to share anything that any thoughts you may have on philanthropy and higher education that you haven't had a chance to speak to.
No, I do think, as tough as it is right now, that there are a lot of really talented people like the two of you who will keep doing this. And thank goodness, because these institutions have so much to give to the world. They already have, they are right now, and they will in the future.
Well, thank you, Holden Thorp, for being our guest today. And thank you, Susan King, for hosting this wonderful conversation. And those of you who joined us in the audience, thank you also for your time and your attention. Please mark your calendars and register for our next event in this series, which will take place on December 9 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, when Susan King will host Nicole Hannah-Jones. Thank you all and have a great day. Bye-bye.